Welcome to Old People's Stories. Today, we will tell you about Jane Fonda. So please subscribe our channel. Let's go to start the video. Long before the fame, before the headlines and the controversy, there was just a girl, born into privilege, but not peace. Jane Seymour Fonda was born on December 21, 1937, in New York City, into one of Hollywood's most famous families. Her father, Henry Fonda, was already a legendary actor, known for his quiet strength, his integrity, his calm power on screen. But at home, that strength often felt like silence. Her mother, Frances Ford Brocard, was warm, artistic, and fragile, a woman who struggled deeply with her emotions. Jane grew up between two worlds, the perfection of Hollywood's golden age and the pain of a family that didn't know how to heal. When Jane was just 12 years old, tragedy struck. Her mother took her own life while in a psychiatric hospital. For Jane, that loss became a wound that never fully closed, one that would echo through decades of searching, rebellion, and reinvention. As a teenager, Jane learned how to smile for the world even when she didn't feel like it. She attended private schools, appeared flawless on the outside, and learned early that fame doesn't protect anyone from loneliness. But deep down, she was already different from the world she was born into. She wasn't content to play the perfect daughter or the quiet celebrity. There was something restless inside her, a question she couldn't stop asking. Who am I, really? That question would shape everything, her choices, her mistakes, and her greatness. Before she was an actress, before she was an icon, Jane Fonda was a daughter trying to make peace with her past. And from that pain, a woman of extraordinary depth began to emerge.
The rise to stardom, beauty, talent, and the weight of expectations. Hollywood was waiting for her. In the late 1950s, Jane Fonda stepped onto the stage of American cinema with the grace of someone born for the spotlight and the confusion of someone still searching for herself. Her first big break came on Broadway, under the direction of the great Lee Strasberg, who saw in her something raw and real. He told her, "You have the spark your father had, but you must find your own flame." That spark soon became a fire. By the early 1960s, Jane was one of Hollywood's most dazzling young stars. She starred in films like Tall Story, Cat Ballou, and Barbarella, the last of which made her an international symbol of beauty and desire. But behind the glamour, Jane felt trapped. She had the fame, the money, the recognition, and yet she didn't feel seen. Directors adored her. Magazines called her the perfect American woman, but Jane didn't believe it. She felt like she was performing not just for the camera, but for everyone in her life. Her father's approval, the public's admiration, the world's expectations. Underneath the makeup and the spotlight was a woman asking again, "Who am I, really?" She began to look beyond Hollywood for answers. She read philosophy. She studied the world. She met people who opened her eyes to politics, injustice, and the idea that art could mean something more than applause. Still, the world only saw the movie star, a woman of beauty, not a woman of thought. That disconnect became unbearable. In her mid-30s, Jane's life began to change. She met Tom Hayden, a political activist and writer, and through him she entered a new world, one that would soon test everything she thought she knew about fame, freedom, and courage. The transformation had begun. The Hollywood star was about to become something far more complicated and far more real.
The 1970s arrived like a storm. America was changing, torn apart by the Vietnam War, shaken by protests, and divided by questions no one could easily answer. And in the middle of that storm stood Jane Fonda, no longer content to be just a movie star. She had seen too much. The glamour of Hollywood felt hollow when she compared it to the suffering of young men sent to war, the cries of the poor, the anger in the streets. For the first time in her life, Jane found a cause that was bigger than herself. She began speaking out, first quietly, then loudly. She traveled, learned, and listened to activists and veterans who had seen the pain of war firsthand. To her, this was not rebellion, it was awakening. But to much of America, Jane Fonda was stepping far out of line. Her trip to North Vietnam in 1972 would change everything and nearly destroy her career. Images of her sitting near anti-aircraft guns meant to symbolize her protest of the war were broadcast around the world. To her supporters, she was brave. To her critics, she was a traitor. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Jane had gone to understand, to bear witness, to use her fame for something meaningful. But the photographs and the rage they stirred would follow her for decades. Through the noise, the hate, and the headlines, Jane refused to stop caring. She apologized for the pain her actions caused, but never for her beliefs. And in the years that followed, she continued to speak for justice, for peace, for women, and for those without a voice. That period of her life left deep scars, but also deep wisdom. She learned that being misunderstood was sometimes the price of being true. And even as Hollywood turned its back on her, she found a different kind of strength, the strength to stand alone. This was the fire that would forge the next version of Jane Fonda, not the rebel, not the beauty, but the survivor.
By the 1980s, Jane Fonda had lived a dozen lives: daughter, movie star, activist, and outcast. But if there was one thing she had always known how to do, it was to begin again. Hollywood had cooled toward her, but the world hadn't forgotten her name. She still carried the charisma, the intelligence, and the courage that made her unforgettable. And now, she was ready to use them in a new way, one that would change not only her life, but the lives of millions of women. It began almost by accident. Jane had discovered exercise as a way to heal, to manage stress, to rebuild her body, and to find balance in a life that had seen so much chaos. What started as a personal habit soon became a revolution. In 1982, she released her first Jane Fonda workout video. No one expected what would happen next. The video became a phenomenon, the first of its kind, selling millions of copies and inspiring a global movement. Living rooms turned into gyms. Mothers, daughters, and grandmothers began moving, stretching, and finding strength they didn't know they had. And for Jane, it wasn't just about fitness. It was about empowerment. Through every jump, stretch, and breath, she was teaching something deeper. That no matter your age, your body, or your past, you can change, you can grow, you can begin again. But behind the success, Jane was also working on something harder: forgiveness. Forgiveness for her parents, for her critics, for herself. She began to understand that her restlessness, her need to always transform, came from pain that had never been spoken. And now, through age and reflection, she began to make peace with it. She returned to acting with a new purpose, winning Oscars and respect not just for her beauty or her fame, but for her strength. She had fallen, risen, and rebuilt herself more than once, and the world had begun to see not just the star, but the woman behind it. The rebel was gone. In her place stood a woman of grace, still fierce, but gentler now, still searching, but finally finding answers that came not from protest or applause, but from peace.
Wisdom, aging, and renewal. Time, the great sculptor, softened the edges of Jane Fonda's life. The noise faded, the headlines quieted, and what remained was something stronger, a woman at peace with her scars. By her 60s, Jane had begun to look inward more than ever before. She spoke openly about her mistakes, her marriages, her search for love, and the weight of guilt that had followed her for years. She called it the third act, a chapter of life when, instead of chasing approval, she began seeking truth. She discovered spirituality, not through religion, but through reflection. In quiet mornings and long walks, she found beauty in stillness, in forgiveness, in simply being. She learned that growing older isn't about fading away. It's about awakening to who you've always been. She became a voice for women again, but this time in a gentler, wiser way. She talked about aging honestly, the fear, the freedom, and the power of acceptance. She told the world that wrinkles were not flaws, but stories written by time. And when she spoke, people listened because she had lived every word. Still, Jane never stopped moving. She continued to act, to write, to speak for the planet, for justice, for women's rights. Her energy became quieter, but more focused, like a river that has learned how to carve its own path through stone. In interviews, she smiled and said, "I used to think I had to be perfect. Now, I just want to be whole." And in that sentence was the truth of her life, that every role, every protest, every heartbreak had been leading her here. Her face carried the light of someone who had seen every kind of storm and had chosen again and again to stand in the sun. This was no longer the Jane Fonda of controversy or glamour. This was a woman who had made peace with herself, and through that peace found a new kind of power.
There comes a moment in every long life when you stop running from your past and you begin to walk beside it. For Jane Fonda, that moment arrived quietly. No flashing lights, no grand applause, just understanding. She began to look back not with regret, but with gratitude. Every mistake, every scar, every risk, it had all been a teacher. The pain of her childhood had taught her empathy. The storms of her activism had taught her courage. The reinventions had taught her resilience. And time had taught her grace. In her later years, Jane became more open than ever before. She spoke about mortality, not with fear,
but with curiosity. She said, "I don't fear dying. What I fear is not living fully before I go." She laughed more. She forgave more. She used her fame not to be admired, but to make a difference, fighting for the planet, mentoring young women, and reminding people that aging is not an ending, but an evolution. Even now, she continues to inspire millions, not through glamour, but through authenticity. She has shown that strength is not about never falling. It's about standing up every single time you do. And that beauty is not in perfection, it's in honesty. Looking at Jane Fonda's journey, you don't just see a famous name. You see a mirror of what it means to be human, to struggle, to learn, to grow, to forgive, and to keep becoming. Because through all her chapters, through all her storms, Jane Fonda never stopped evolving. She never stopped asking, "Who am I, really?" And maybe that question, asked again and again through a lifetime, is the secret to becoming whole. As the lights fade and her story settles into memory, one truth remains clear. She was not just a star, not just an activist, not just a woman. She was a soul in motion, a reminder that it's never too late to change, to heal, to rise, and to live again.